During the summer, when she was up in Michigan and getting more and more hours, because even in those days you had to have a certain number of hours to go on to the next step, she and a friend, her friend Alice, were flying out one afternoon, and they ran out of fuel. And unfortunately, they made a very safe landing, but it was right in the middle of a farmer's alfalfa field just prior to harvest. And for any of you who know about farming, that is absolutely a no-no. I mean, they went right through the middle and made a great big swath right through. Well, they got out, and the farmer is coming across the field saying things pretty much unconventional and waving a rake. And they had to think quickly. And so she ran up to him and said, "Oh, I'm so sorry. We lost a niffling pin, and we had to land. And there was nothing we could do." And here are these two little girls, what, 17 years old. And so he took pity on them and said, Oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. And pretty soon all three of them are looking through the field. Ever afterwards in our family, when something went wrong and nobody knew exactly what it was the niffling. Anyway, unfortunately, her second year, at the end of her second year in Vassar, the depression caught up with her. My grandfather, her father, was a typical doctor, not a very good investor of things, and ran out of money. And so she had to leave. And they told her that she could either come back to Houghton, which was pretty much nowhere, or she needed to go to secretarial school in New York. That idea was so depressing, I guess, to her, that she continued to rent airplanes and do charters, taking people for money. And so she continued with her schooling as far as her getting more 36, and he had already started a business which was actually a sales and service agency called Intercity Aviation outside Boston, and they sold Beechcraft aircraft. Well, one of their customers actually loaned them a new stagger wing Beech, which was a biplane that the two wings are like this, very the latest thing. When they went on their honeymoon, they were going out west to California. The deal was that since they were both flying, they divided it into legs, the trip, depending on where the fuel stops were. Seemed to make sense. Whoever's leg it was made all the decisions, was the pilot. Well, that was fine until it was my mother's leg, and they were somewhere over Nevada, out in the middle of nowhere in the desert. And she looked down and she said, "Where are we going to have to stop so-and-so to get fuel?" Like any man, my father said, "Oh, come on, you can make it to so-and-so." My mother said, "No, you can't." "Yes, you can." "No, yes, no, yes." So she said, "We'll show you." So they kept on flying, and they made a forced landing in the desert. They never flew together after that. Until I think it was maybe 67, when I was learning how to fly, and my mother and my flight instructor got together and had purchased a 150, a Cessna 150, which is a trainer. They flew together one more time. I think the flight lasted maybe 17 minutes. And that was the end of that. It's very hard for two people who have very different ways of thinking about things. Anyway, she worked for the Air Commerce Bureau, also doing air marking for general aviation, because there were quite a bit of preparations already going on, thinking that we might get into the war, and to be able to see from the air. Navigation was at a really rudimentary stage, so by painting the locations on top of large buildings, they could find out where they were. During this time, my mother acquired her multi-engine instrument and seaplane ratings, which allowed them to fly up to eastern Maine and in a friend's seaplane and fly under the Deer Isle Bridge, which is now really, really illegal, but they used to think it was lots of fun.
Not very popular.
Not to mention dangerous. She also, in 1937 and 38, takes a little bit of time, was doing some testing for the Gwin air car, which was supposed to be the vehicle of the future for a family. It held 2 people. It had a steering wheel. It flew 125 miles an hour, and it had foot pedals, which regulated the landing gear and the brakes and the wing flaps and the speed. It also had tricycle gear, which means that there's a wheel in the front, whereas most of the airplanes in those days, the smaller planes, were all tail draggers. One of my mother's jobs in this business was making particularly hard landings to see whether the tricycle gear would collapse or not. Yeah, and it didn't. It was very durable, and it was then pretty much used on all the large and heavy aircraft for both for general and military aviation. The Joseph Gwin was the aeronautical engineer. He is the fellow on the left, and then my mother, and the test pilot, Frank Hawks. Then the war approached. Now, there were 2 programs, as I may have mentioned. Jackie Cochran who was a pilot and did a lot of racing and so forth, had this idea that women could be of help and could fly airplanes and do whatever jobs that men were doing within the country. She got short shrift, and of course, everyone, including Congress, thought that women couldn't possibly do it anyway, so she got fed up and left for England. In the meantime, where, by the way, women were flying and had gotten military status in 1939. My mother wrote General Bob Olds, who was the organizer of the Air Transport Command, with another idea. Her idea was take a few women who already had licenses and enough time so that they had already been flying multi-engine aircraft and so forth, and use them to move the trainers and the aircraft from the factories and out to the training areas for the student pilots. Unfortunately, General Tunner, who headed the whole fairing division, really didn't see any need in 1939, 1940. He just felt that women weren't going to be able to do the job anyway, so that went by the board. By 1942 was a little different story, because by then they were running out of pilots. Everybody that could fly was already in training or already flying in Europe. So my mother got permission finally to send out. General Tunner said, if you can find candidates that will meet certain specifications, we'll try this. He was not very confident. So she sent out 83 telegrams, and 25 responded, of which 18 became the originals. Now, these were women who already had quite a bit of time. They had to be between 21 and 35 years old, be high school graduates, have flown at least 500 hours. They needed to have a 200 horsepower rating and a commercial license. And they also had to have cross-country experience, because they were going to be moving these airplanes all the way from east to west coast to all the different bases. So they began at Newcastle, Delaware, and from what I understand, the housing was rudimentary. They were sort of old World War I barracks, training barracks. It was pretty grim stuff and very cold, but they were all interested in doing this for the country. And the 18 women said, whatever it takes, we're going to do it. Well, they had to live the military way. They had to learn all the rules, military rules. And of course, because the soldiers at the bases had to march and do all those things, so did the women. I can't begin to tell you how popular that was with all of them. It was really popular with my mother, who definitely was not keen on marching. But never mind, one Sunday morning they're marching at the end of an unused runway, back and forth, doing all this stuff. She gets them all marching along. They get to the end of the runway. She cannot remember the expression for about face or about turn. They take it as the biggest joke in the world, and staying in perfect formation, they march right over the end of the runway and down into the field roaring with laughter. But they did do their marching. She finally figured it out. She's going, wait, stop, turn, no, not that. They don't care, they're just gonna laugh. When they first started out, they were just flying small trainers and very small airplanes. Sorry, this is a little bit slow to catch up here. They gradually moved to more sophisticated aircraft, but a lot of these had to be flown to places. For instance, they might have to go from the East Coast to, there was a big base in Oklahoma, there was another one in Texas. Unfortunately, since they started in September of 1942, they had all winter to fly these open cockpit airplanes. They only flew during daylight hours, but as you can imagine, it was pretty rugged. When they got somewhere, wherever they got at the end of the day, they could only stay at certain places because one of the concerns with Congress was that this group of women were going to become ladies with reputations, and my mother was particularly keen on the appearance of things. It didn't matter whether they were as good as gold, they still were way out there as far as what women were used to doing in this period of time. So they would have to go to a boarding house where there was practically a house mother, and then they were not allowed to be on any non-public transportation with men. So even though there might be a flight going back of an airplane with pilots, military pilots, they couldn't go on it. They had to go by bus or by train, and sometimes it was days going, of course, you fly a lot faster than you go by bus, to get back to take the next ferrying job to wherever it needed to go. Let's see where we are here. The uniforms, when they arrived, consisted of, and this is not a joke, they had used mechanics overalls. The smallest size was 44 long. My mother was 5'6", and as you can see, she's got the belt wrapped around her about 2.5 times. And if you saw it on the ground, you can see the arms are wrapped, and so are that was their very, very fancy outfit. But they just persevered. They were there to fly, and they weren't really interested in fashion, which is probably a good thing. Now here's the whole gear, and that's a parachute which they had to sit on. Since there was no other place to put it. But of course, not having the parachute was also not really a good option. Years later, when we said, gosh, you always had a parachute, did you ever have to use it? And she said, well, thank heavens, I never did. And she said, but these crazy people who were jumping out of airplanes, why would you jump out of a perfectly good airplane? She just didn't understand that the skydiving was just, whoa. Believe me, they hoped very much they never had to jump out. They did end up flying all of the aircraft that was flown by any of the pilots. Now, Jackie Cochran's idea was to train people from scratch. At the very beginning, the girls were to have 200 flying hours. That quickly went out the window, and literally, her group trained over 1,100 housewives who had never seen an airplane, how to fly. And the flying, because of the necessities of the time, involved some maintenance, it involved navigation, it involved all of the things that the men had to do. They came from all, they came from all over. 21 to 25 years of age, 200 flying hours, and that was eliminated shortly. They had to be 5'3" tall and 120 pounds. Well, as you noted on one of the slides before, one of the originals, Betty Gillies, who was a particular friend of my mother's, was only 5'1", and I mean, she was short to me when I was a little girl. She was really small. She had to have pedals under, wooden pedals and pillows underneath, but she was a terrific pilot. So they went on gradually advancing. Some of them learned on the Link trainer, which was developed by Edwin Link here in Binghamton. And here's a picture with both men and women in front of a kind of beat up looking B-17, but they took a lot of abuse, a great deal of abuse. If it looks like duct tape on it, it probably is. They did manage to bring some of those airplanes back literally with very large chunks, functional chunks of tail and wing and everything gone. They were amazing airplanes. The women were encouraged to fly the B-17 because it had gotten a reputation as a widowmaker. Unfortunately, the boys who were flying it were being what my mother used to term cowboys, and they'd get to fooling around, and in no time, it was forgiving, but not that forgiving. And there were a lot of accidents, and of course, that was an expensive thing, both in terms of human life and aircraft. I think at one point, some of you may have seen that on public television, I think they were actually producing 1 or 2 B-17s, entire B-17s in a day at the busiest time. And some of them, of course, the quality control was sort of shaky, yeah, in the interest of the war effort. And unfortunately, they did lose some pilots and some women pilots from those issues. In 1943, General Tunner, who was the general who actually was sort of the sponsor of the original WASP group, had an order for 100 B-17s to go to Europe. He felt that the women were perfectly capable, and he said to my mother and Betty Gillies, why don't you guys go along with them, because that would mean an intercontinental flight, and that would be a good feather in your cap. Oh, there were a lot of politics, just like any other time, so they got as far as Goose Bay. And the big boys, General Arnold, either heard about it from rumor or heard about it perhaps from Miss Cochran, who was just a tiny bit jealous about this. And he sent a cease and desist order as they were taxiing out of Goose Bay, Newfoundland, and going to England. The Jeep, my mother said, was literally following them down the runway, and they decided, since they were waving enthusiastically, they would stop, and that was the end of that. So they never did get to England. There is a picture, I don't know if it's right here. So, wonderful picture of them in, hello?
There it is.
Oh. Well, there's another. On that crew, my mother and Betty decided that they would pick their crew very carefully, and they had, besides themselves a co-pilot, they had an engineer and a navigator. And the fellow that they picked as a navigator had been with them before and had been abroad and flown the route many times. But my mother swore that in his duffel bag, the only things that were there were 7 bottles of rum and a toothbrush. Now, this would not give me a lot of confidence, but, if that's his lucky charm, I guess. He'd gotten back and forth a number of times. One of the things that the WASP did when they had their big group of women is they towed targets for military ground gunnery practice, which means that those huge guns on the ground are practicing to get a target that you are towing. What can I say? It sounded pretty scary to me. And they did occasionally have an accident. In one, it blew away most of the tail of the airplane, and the women managed to land it safely. But they also, at the very end, they ended up taking a lot of airplanes that came in terrible shape and to places where they were either dismantled or, if they were in good enough shape, repaired. So there were a lot of, I mean, they did a lot of things, and it was a very short period of time. And every time I go over this stuff, I realize what a short period of time. It was from September 1942 to December of 1944, and that's all. I mean, all these things were going on during this very short time. Let me see. There's a picture of more of the fly girls with their leather jackets on. Yeah, the heat in any of these airplanes was almost. These are some of the planes that they flew. This was my mother's favorite, the B-17. And if any of you, and I know a couple of you have been to air shows and seen these, if you really, really need to go and walk around these, because it looks huge and it is a big airplane, but compared to, for instance, a 707 or any of our commercial, it isn't that big, but it is ferocious looking, and to go inside, there is no that gets you from the cockpit to anywhere towards the tail. It's pretty amazing. The P-51, which is it's a single fighter, they now have redone a few of the ones that are still alive and have made them into two-place airplanes. But I think it is still the fastest propeller-driven airplane in the world. And my mother was the first woman to fly it, and my father said it scared her to death. I don't think she enjoyed it very much. This is the P-38. This was also a fighter. It was not flown in any kind of order, what do they call it? Formation. Because I actually got to sit in one in Washington, and when you're sitting in the cockpit, those huge engine pods forbid any sight to the side at all, and that was not a plus, but otherwise it was very quick and agile. And actually my parents, after the war, bought one for almost nothing because who in the heck are you going to sell those things? That lasted about, I think maybe 6 weeks. It uses 120 gallons of avgas an hour, and if you're at a small airport, the exhaust is so huge it literally blows over any small airplane. This is the P-47, another fighter. All the Ps, of course, are fighters. This is the crew, part of the crew. There was one other guy. This is when they were on their way out of Goose Bay. My mother and Betty Gillies, and the fellow with the 7 bottles of rum and the toothbrush. He looked like he might carry 7 bottles of rum and a toothbrush. This gives you some statistics, and in a really, really short time, they really managed to get a lot of airplanes in a lot of places. I believe it was over 50% of all of the aircraft that had to be moved were ferried by women. As you also know, women also worked in the factories, and all kinds of factories, doing all sorts of things during World War II, which allowed them, for instance, to put out an entire B-17 in a day. 60 million miles. Looks like P-47 right there. And this was a little insignia that was designed by Disney. It was painted on a lot of the airplanes that they flew. And was sort of a good luck charm. This was at the National Aviation Hall of Fame in 2005, and well, I don't like public speaking. This was really terrifying. I think there were 2,500 people or something, just in a huge, huge ballroom. But the woman standing next to me is Patty Wagstaff, who I don't know if you've ever seen any of those trick flyers that go upside down, do all the loops. She's the ultimate champion of that. And this picture I particularly like. In 2010, the women were finally acknowledged, because after the war, while there was a short speech in 1944 about how we'll never forget you, they were instantly forgotten. They got absolutely no benefits whatsoever, and actually, when one of them was killed, and a number of them were, they had to pay their own funeral expenses, and sometimes for some of the girls that meant asking everybody in the room for a donation, literally. We went to the ceremony in Washington, which was, oh dear, lots of politicians giving the same speech. But there were 126 of the women still alive, including my youngest sister's godmother, who was just a really, also one of the originals, and just a lot of fun. And it was fun to talk to them and see them. We were picking up our medal, my mother's medal, posthumously, obviously. So my sister and I went to another room where we were to pick it up, and we had been asking about Barbara Erickson London, who was a particular friend of my mother's, and she lives in California. She was 90 at this point. And we had heard that she had decided not to make the trip by commercial airline. Anybody that's on my commercial airline knows why you don't want to really make that trip at the tonight. And we were hoping that it was just a little too much for her and that her health was good. While we were sitting there, a reporter came up and started talking to a woman that was sitting in front of me, who I hadn't seen. I come in and sat behind her. And she said to her, "Are you Barbara London?" And the woman said, "Yes." Well, it was. And it turned out that Barbara Erickson London has a daughter who is a full captain on American Airlines. Her granddaughter works for a movie mogul in California. When the movie mogul heard that Grandma was going to get a congressional medal, he said to her, "Take the Learjet for the week and take Grandma to the ceremony." So she arrived in a Learjet. Very fitting. Anyway, these are actually her hands. I was standing behind them when they took this picture, and it's sort of neat. She was very well coiffed, and she's just really together at 90. And her remark about this really said a lot about the attitude of these women, because they were really old shoe. They were doing this because they wanted to. They didn't expect recognition or anything else, or payment. They would like to have been militarized to have some basic benefits, but the job was flying, and that's what they wanted to do. She looked at the medal and turned it over, and the whole group was standing around her, and she said, "This is really nice of them to do." She said, "This and 25 cents will get you a cup of coffee." And that says it. I mean, that just did it for me. I just thought. She passed away in February of this year, peacefully, but she did a lot for aviation after the fact, and encouraged a lot of people. This is my mother and my younger two sisters and myself sitting on the wing of our Bonanza, getting ready for a trip. And for all of those of us who have had children in the back of a car and no idea when they're misbehaving, I wish I knew the secret to that discipline, because I never remember being reprimanded. I can't imagine what it would have been like having mischievous children in the back of an airplane. That's beyond me. So huge respect. Unfortunately, my mother passed away before any of our kids came along, so I didn't get a chance to thank her because, boy, I really appreciate it. We did have one incident. My sister and I, sister who's standing, were strapped in the back seat. We were going into one of the major airports because, of course, that both my parents maintained, although they never flew together, they maintained all their instrument ratings and so forth. And we were going into Boston or Washington or what used to be Idlewild, New York, wherever. And my sister and I, because we were bored, were singing, which we used to do all the time, but we would bump our backs against the back. And we got more and more enthusiastic about this. And just as my mother was on final, she noticed all of a sudden that the airplane was going on. And she actually called the tower and said, "I've got a problem. I'm going to need, instructions for forced landing." Emergency landing. She turned around to check our seatbelts, and there we are singing at the top of our lungs, going bump, bump. Yes. Well, that was an interesting little sidelight. There are many, many books on the women pilots, and they all have sort of a different take on things. I missed the bottom line. This last one, Nancy Love and the Wasp, Ferry Pilots of World War II, was also written by Sarah Byrne Rickman. And there's so many stories. I mean, I've just told you a few personal stories, but they all have amazing stories to tell because you can imagine, they're in some cases taking disabled aircraft, they're taking old aircraft, they're taking aircraft with very few navigational aids and pretty rudimentary everything else across the country, and things happen. They had all kinds of incidents. One that I thought about, and I forgot to put in here, my sister's godmother, who was kind of a bit of a wild woman, but a very good pilot, was flying, I believe it was a P-38, it was something with belly tanks across the country to the base for training future pilots. And they were told that if they had to make a forced landing, to drop the belly tanks for obvious reasons, because if you do a forced landing, you're going to blow yourself to pieces with the belly tanks. Well, these women were had such a sense of patriotism that the last thing they wanted to do, I mean, that was thousands of dollars. They didn't want to do that. So it was open country out in the Midwest, and she found a long dirt road, and she said, "I think I can make it." So she's going along, of course, she's losing altitude. She finds a place where the electric wires are far enough away, and she's just about to land, and a little country bus pulls out of the side road, and she just barely lands in front of it. She comes to a halt, pushes back the canopy, and stands up and goes, The a very attractive woman, bus driver walks up alongside the airplane, looks up and says, "What's the matter, lady? You tired of flying?" These women had it all. They had courage, and you could get them to laugh about it, but they really, my mother didn't talk about it, and the other pilots it was just something that they did. It was just no big deal. 38 women pilots were killed, 11 during training and 27 in service. And I hope we'll remember all of them, the women who contributed either flying or doing all of the other things that they did. Does anybody have any questions?
If anybody has a desire to fly in any of these old planes, the Collins Institute up in Massachusetts still flies B-17, B-24, and a P-51 Mustang, and you can arrange to have a ride.
Her mother and her aunt took her and her cousin to Europe that summer. And they were at the airport and saw Lindbergh land. And everybody says, "Well, I would have gotten you started." She was 15, and it didn't, but the next year, this barnstormer came along, and he offered For a penny a pound, I'll take you for a ride. Well, she was just hooked. And after that, her instructor was a local kid who literally had about 10 more flying hours than she did. And he went for his instructors, which she didn't, I don't think she ever went for her instructors. So his direction, instead of going just to commercial and transport ratings, was to be an instructor. And so her instructor was just a local boy who wanted to learn how to fly, and so that's where she learned. And then, of course, she went on to commercial ratings and so forth with other people.
I take it her parents didn't object to her?
Well, here's the odd thing. You would think, as I said, my grandfather was a doctor, and my grandmother was Edwardian and extremely straight-laced. Oh, boy. It was not my grandmother who objected. My grandfather just had a fit about it. My grandmother said, go for it. So you never know. I think it did make them somewhat nervous. It should have at that time. You know, she was very adventurous and so.
Anna, could you tell us a story about how you and your sisters used to go to the doctors?
Oh, this was funny. When I guess I was in college, I went to Ithaca College, and I was talking to some riding friends one day, and we were talking about trying to get to medical facilities, and I said, yeah, we moved to Martha's Vineyard as a family. My father was with Allegheny and retired, and we moved to Martha's Vineyard, where he bought Martha's Vineyard Shipyard, which is not anybody's idea of retirement except his. The expression ADD comes to mind, but anyway. In those days, Martha's Vineyard, believe it or not, had a very little in the way of medical anything. And because it was populated very heavily between Memorial Day and Labor Day, it was just as unevenly and unpopulated the rest of the time. There was nothing open in the middle of winter. After Labor Day, there were no movie theaters, there were no restaurants. There was one sort of a snack bar that was open until noon on Saturday and 5 o'clock on weekdays, and that was it. There was nothing to do, no place. And it was like being, for the teachers I know, they had a terrible time getting teachers. It was like being sent to Siberia. There was absolutely nothing. And we did get a series of some really interesting teachers here for a while I was in elementary school. But anyway, so my mother, of course, had established all these doctors back when we lived in Washington, D.C., in Alexandria, actually. And let me see, I was 4, and my sisters would have been 2, and the other one wasn't born quite, my youngest sister hadn't been born yet. But she'd established all these doctors. So what we do is we just fly back when we had an appointment for the doctor. We just get in the airplane, fly back to Washington. And I didn't think about it as being peculiar, because I sort of grown up with it, but when I was telling my friends, they said, you what? And there was no big deal about flying into all these big airports, except that when I got a little older, my mother would let me hold the approach plates, which are sort of the directions to the airport and the space above the airport so that everybody is going the same direction. But you need those when you're going into a big airport like Washington or New York and so forth. So that was the big privilege when you got to hold them on your lap.
How many planes did your parents have altogether?
They had, over time, we only had one at a time when we had a Beechcraft Bonanza, and I think part of the Beechcraft thing was because they had been dealers. They sold them. It was a very fast, it was the butterfly tail one, I don't know if you're familiar with that.
Yeah.
It's a very fast 5-person airplane. The only thing is that it was not very forgiving and had a tendency to go downhill so fast that it flew out of its wings. So you really had to pay attention. Yes. Well, if you're flying with visual, that isn't so much of a problem, but with instruments, people sometimes get disoriented and they don't realize, and I don't know if you've ever flown in really cloudy weather and you can't really tell whether you're up or down or whatever, and they would fly out of their wings. Anyway, we had one when we first moved there, and that met its demise during one of the hurricanes that went over Martha's Vineyard, because my father, hearing that it was going to go right over the vineyard, took the airplane to Falmouth on the Cape, put it in a really safe hangar. The hurricane turned and went right over that hangar, and the entire airplane was about a foot high. Someone actually bought it and put it back together, but my father said he would never fly it. And he actually saw that somebody was flying it after that, and then we got another command. They had various airplanes. I think they had a staggering beach for a short time, and they had seaplane, but only one at a time. Anybody else?
What about Love Field in Texas?
What's that?
Love
Love Field has nothing to do with us. Love Field was named way, way later, long after. It had another name, and I don't remember what it was before it was Love Field. But actually, the WASP main area was Sweetwater, Texas, which was a little way from there. So,
Planted question, did she ever fly around here?
what's that?
Did she ever fly around here?
Well, she came up to Ithaca, and she flew into the old Ithaca Airport, which is now the Hangar Theater, on the way up to Watertown. And she was familiar with it because she did the air marking. So she did some in the Binghamton area and out by Hornell, and yeah.
When did you learn to fly?
Let me see. It was when I was 21. I started when I was 18 and I started taking lessons. And my mother sort of tricked me into it because I hadn't even thought about flying. And she had bought this airplane. My younger sister actually started flying before her interest, before me. But of course, she wasn't old enough. You have to be 16 to solo. And so one day she said, during the summer I was home from vacation, she said, "You want to come for a ride with me?" I said, "Oh, sure," in this little trainer. And we had such a good time. She said, "You want to take lessons?" Was this all prepared or not? And so I took lessons with a woman that I had known since childhood, who was just a super instructor. I mean, they'd actually stayed with us when my parents went away one time. So she was completely familiar, and she was really very straightforward about everything, and just a wonderful teacher. I'll never forget the morning that I soloed, and my mother knew it was going to happen pretty soon, but I, blithely going on and on, "She'll just stay with me, it's okay, it's okay." I learned at a small grass field, and so you can't do go-rounds, you've got to take off and land and then go back to the beginning and start over again. So we'd done a number of takeoffs and landings, and we got to the end and bumped along the grass field, and I started my preparation to take off, and Carolyn opened the door and stepped out. I went, "Wait a minute, where are you going?" She said, "You'll be fine." No. I won't, please come back. She wouldn't come back, and I did manage to make 3 successful landings, so we were all But it's quite an experience, because what they do at little local airports, I don't know if they do that at big airports, is they cut a little piece out of the back of your shirt, a little square, and they write the date of your solo, and they stick it up on the wall. And it's very common in little airports. You'll see all these little things. So my mother was very careful that I wore an old shirt. Talk about engineering things. I didn't see that coming at all. But it was a lot of fun. So.
Tri-Cities Airport over in Union.
Mm-hmm.
When I was a little boy, I spent time over there a lot. And all these pieces of the cloth used to be on the wall.
And that's what they are. Well, and when I was getting ready to test for my license, you have to go on certain cross countries, and you have 3 short cross countries. One of mine was going to be at Elmira, and it was in the middle of summer, and I flew over there, and what you had to do was land and go in and find someone to sign your logbook, and then you get back in your airplane and fly back. So that seems simple enough. And Elmira, I mean, literally from Ithaca, you hardly get up to cruising, and you're there. You're right there. So I went in and found somebody, and it got to be more and more difficult, even though that was long before the kind of security we have now. But finding somebody because all the doors are locked and you've got to find some place to get in anyway. Got all that done. It was really a hot day. And they had said, of course I landed on the short, they've got a short runway over there, and I didn't need anything more, so they put me over in the short runway. Came back out. They had been repairing the large runway, and actually the flights had not come into Elmira for, I don't know, 2 weeks because they're resurfacing it or doing whatever. So I called the tower and I said, okay, we're ready to leave. And he said, taxiway this and this and that. One of the problems with a small airplane on a big airport is, I don't know if you've ever seen the numbers at a big airport, but they're about from here to somewhere out there in the field. If you're in a jumbo jet, they're very clear. Unfortunately, when you're at this angle, you can't even read the number. So anyway, I had to ask several times. I got started out the right taxiway and got to the end and was doing my run up to take off. And I looked down the runway, and here is these black and white barriers that they use on the highway. I mean, huge. They're like 25 feet high, and they're right across the middle of the runway. And I'm going, oh boy. So I called up the tower. I said, I'm sorry, guys, but I'm on the wrong runway. I'm sorry. And I described the airplane, gave the number and everything. I said, I'm sitting right here, and there are these barricades. And there was dead silence on the other one. I said, anybody there? And they're laughing. And I said, I'm sorry, I'm trying, just tell me how to get where I need to go to the other runway. He said, you're on the right runway. I said, I can't be. There are these huge barriers. Well, now a 150 can practically take off in the length of the parking lot if you have to. But this was right in front, and it was way high. I mean, there's no way. And one of the things that my flight instructor said, you're the pilot. You make the decision. It doesn't matter who in a tower says something to you or anything. It's your airplane, and you have to make the decision. If it doesn't look right, don't do it. So I called them back again. I said, look, I'm sorry, but I can't make it over. I can do a short field takeoff. I grew up flying out of a short field. I'm really good at these, but not that good. He said, don't worry about it, just go. So I just said, okay. Well, it was a mirage. It was a very hot day. And I'm running down this runway, and this barricade is getting closer and closer. And I'm, as soon as but believe me, that was the shortest short field takeoff I ever made, because I just hopped it. And as I was 10, 15 feet in the air, that barricade is 2.5 miles down the runway, and it's no threat at all. I mean, I was 1,000 feet over it by the time I got to it. But I felt so silly, so I called back to tower and I said, I'm really sorry. They laughed and they said, that's okay. You new at this? Yeah, well, yeah. Bye, guys. Anyway, and I'm sure I'm not the only one that's ever done that, but it was very embarrassing.
Are you still flying, Henry, at all?
No, both Bron and I flew there for a while, but it's very expensive, and it's gotten much more expensive. And I was in the process of having a family. That kind of got in the way of things. And also, to keep your flying hours up, I was flying with the East Hill Flying Club, and they had the ROTC there, which flew on a regular basis. Those student planes can only fly 100 hours without going for a checkup, so to speak. They have to go to Seneca Falls. They have to be flown over to Seneca Falls every 100 hours. So I'd sign the book in Ithaca and go home to Canada, thinking I'm going to fly, and it's in Seneca Falls. And that got to be kind of a problem. As far as anyone thinking about flying around here, you really need an instrument rating because, as we know, it's always cloudy here. And that was going to be a lot more expensive. And with an instrument rating, you have to keep up all the time. You have to be flying all the time, which is an expensive business. And my parents actually gave theirs up. They gave all of their licenses up when I was about, I don't know, 12 or 13. But they just didn't, they were perfectionists, and they'd obviously flown everything there was. My father had too, had flown all the B-17s and the P-38s and all that. And there was no second rating. They were going to do it right or not at all, and so they just gave up. They had a lot of friends who didn't give up, and some of them had really unfortunate, being a little arrogant about the whole thing, and you just can't do. There's not much space because in an airplane you cannot pull over to the side of the road while you figure out what you're going to do. Anybody else?
I've been over to that museum over near Elmira Airport, and they have a terrific amount of airplanes there, but most of them were war things, you know, that the men flew with. I didn't see anything about women.
Well, of course, some places do, I mean, they don't have anything about the women, but I've been surprised at some of the airports we've been in. There was, and I can't remember whether it was Dallas maybe, it had a huge display right in the you know, right in the airport while we were waiting. It was fun to look at. Yeah.
But they do have a good, you know,
Supply of,
about flying. It's really wonderful. We went a couple, 3 years ago. I think they moved it since then. I
Yeah,
think
they
they made
did.
it larger.
I was just gonna make a comment that, on my iPad in the App Store, there's an app called Fly Girl. And when you upload it, it just has a lot of stories of various women have written little bios or stories about their.
oh, I'll bet you there are. I mean, I just can't even imagine all the stories there must be.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, most of those women are, I mean, there can't be more than a handful left.
Right.
They'd be in their hundreds now, but we're grateful to them. And I know that my mother had people walk up to her, young women who ended up being pilots, and they were really grateful to all of the women pilots for going ahead and doing those things because they wouldn't have gotten here.
Yeah, now they're flying in combat.
Yeah. Well, thank you very
Well,
much.
thank you.